ドクター・ケイプの特 A 級対策。香港の歴史で絶対に押さえておきたい点をドクター・ケイプがあっという間に文章化してくださいました。これだけの歴史をすぐに英語で書けるって、もう英語力と知識の量がえぐいですね。実際のドキュメントには注釈がついてるんですけども、動画ではちょっと割愛させていただきました。後日ブログページの方で全ての文献と注釈の方を掲載させていただきますので、そちらの方でご確認ください。第1部 History of the Colony A Brief Background。 これはざっくり言って3つの流れですね。植民地時代と人口増加、朝鮮戦争の影響ですね。で、同時に中小企業の発展で、最後に1960年から80年代の多様化と成長です。これはもうさすがイギリスと言わざるを得ないです。では早速見ていきましょう。
Hong Kong was ceded to the Britain in 1842 under the Treaty of Nanking at the end of the First Anglo-Chinese Opium War, and it remained as a British colony until 1997. During World War II, Japan occupied Hong Kong, which brought the colony's business to a halt and reduced its population. After the war, the colony was returned to the British management, and its population began to grow again, first with a large migratory wave of people from Guangdong, and more after 1947, because of the intensified Chinese Civil War. The high inflation in the mainland, in the late 1940s, also caused large financial flows to the British colony from wealthy Chinese, who wanted to keep their private wealth there. As the communist victory became imminent in 1949, equipment and raw materials that Shanghai textile firms had imported were diverted to Hong Kong. And later, the colony also accepted the large influx of entrepreneurs and workers for light manufacturing sectors, mainly textiles and clothing. The Korean War, 1950 to 1953, also affected Hong Kong's prospect. In December 1950, the US imposed an embargo on China for its involvement in the war. Subsequently, the mainland began to rely less on the British colony and more on the USSR and other Eastern Bloc economies. Hong Kong's development was driven by small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs, many of them family-owned and operated. The upgrading of the local economy thereafter involved foreign firms owned by overseas Chinese. While some manufacturers in Hong Kong, domestic and foreign-owned, moved into more sophisticated production, in the 1960s, the majority of local SMEs remained engaged mostly in labor-intensive activities. The composition of the colony's exports remained within a narrow range of products, such as clothing, textiles, electronics, and miscellaneous manufactured products. During the 1970s, successive waves of local firms in the consumer electronics sector diversified into higher-grade products, mainly to supply the U.S. markets. In the late 1970s, assembly operations in Hong Kong began to be priced out from international competition. China's open-door policy, with the special economic zones, CEZs, in the neighboring Guangdong province, in the early 1980s, provided Hong Kong firms with a new lease of life as foreign investors.
第2部では Joint Declaration on the Future of Hong Kong ということで、一国二制度までのいきさつですね。中英交渉、基本法起草委員会、そして第2の黄金時代、お楽しみください。
Lengthy Sino-British negotiations led to the signing of the 1984 agreement on the Hong Kong's future, including its return to China in 1997. The agreement upheld the principle of one country, two systems, allowing the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region to enjoy a high degree of autonomy, except in foreign and defense affairs, for 50 years, following the official return. It was understood that China would leave Hong Kong economically separate from the mainland, let its foreign exchange and trade controls in place, and restrict the movement of people between them. In 1985, the National People's Congress, China, set up the Basic Law Drafting Committee, BLDC, with 59 members, of whom 23 were from Hong Kong, and 36 were from the mainland, to prepare the Basic Law, the de facto constitution, for Hong Kong for the post-transfer period. The Basic Law was adopted by China in 1990, and came into effect on July 1, 1997, when the sovereignty over Hong Kong was transferred. The Basic Law is the national law of China that serves Hong Kong to implement the Sino-British Joint Declaration. The agreement of the Joint Declaration somewhat improved the political stability and predictability of the colony. Consequently, there was a surge of cross-border investments to Hong Kong by overseas Chinese and Japanese firms. Many Hong Kong firms, mostly in textiles and garment, as well as electronics, relocated their manufacturing activities to the Pearl River Delta in the Guangdong province and deployed the abundant local low-wage labor, thereby enjoying a second golden era.
第3部では Official Return of Hong Kong to China 香港返還です。1. 香港独自の法制度。2. 評議会メンバーに新中国議員が多い。気になります。3. 定価税と自由貿易です。では見ていきましょう。
The official return of Hong Kong to China on July 1, 1997, as well as the activation of the Basic Law at the same time, which coincided with the outbreak of the Asian financial crisis, proceeded without much political disruption. The governor from the colonial period was officially replaced by the chief executive as the head of the Hong Kong following the transfer of sovereignty. The Basic Law made it clear that Hong Kong would retain its own legal system and borders, and basic political rights, including freedom of assembly, free speech and freedom of the press. Hong Kong has a unicameral legislative body, the Legislative Council of 70 seat members. Article 68 of the Basic Law states that all the members of the Legislative Council should ultimately be elected by universal suffrage. However, at this moment, only 40 of the council members are elected by popular votes, the remaining 30 are business representatives, and many of them are pro-China lawmakers. Hong Kong residents have been wary about their future, particularly the degree of their city's autonomy, which has already begun to erode. Hong Kong continued to be active as an intermediary, a commercial and financial hub, to facilitate trade and investment relations between East Asian economies and China. Meanwhile, much of its manufacturing, production, emigrated to Shenzhen, leaving its remaining economic structure mostly engaging in service sector activities. By the end of the 1990s, Hong Kong had become one of the world's most significant havens, characterized by low taxation and free trade.
いよいよ第4部 Gradual Encroachment 映画のタイトルみたいでかっこいいですね。ここでのキーワードは見せかけの民主主義。1. 内部干渉とデモと交流。2. 雨傘革命の末路。3. 引き渡し条例。ご覧ください。
In the new millennium, Hong Kong continued to enjoy freedom, not seen in the mainland, but the increasing number of its residents began to see their freedom being clearly on the decline due to China's increasing meddling in its internal matters. Article 23 of the Basic Law requires that Hong Kong in due course should enact local national security laws. Accordingly, in 2003 the Hong Kong government tabled a national security bill which would, among others, give more power to the police. Witnessing 500,000 demonstrators on the streets against the controversial bill, the Hong Kong government quickly withdrew the proposal. It also backed down over moral, civic and national education classes, following rallies against the move. Despite public resistance, however, there have been many incidents symbolizing official encroachment, such as legal rulings disqualifying pro-democracy politicians in the Legislative Council, and the disappearance of 5 Hong Kong booksellers and a tycoon, who all eventually re-emerged in custody in China. According to the Basic Law, the Legislative Council should be elected in a more democratic way. However, there has been no agreement over what to do for that purpose. In 2014, demonstrators took to the streets peacefully for several weeks, demanding that Hong Kong residents should be given the right to elect their own leader. As a response, the Chinese government made it clear that it would allow voters to choose their leaders from a list approved by a pro-Beijing committee, but critics called this a sham democracy, and it was voted down at the Legislative Council. The protests began in June 2019, over the legislation of a bill that would allow the extradition of criminal suspects from Hong Kong to mainland China. Facing massive and violent protests against the bill, the Hong Kong authorities withdrew it in September. The withdrawal, however, could not pacify the general public, particularly students, who upheld the call for democratic reforms and demanded an inquiry into alleged police brutality. They continue to accuse that press and academic freedoms have been severely compromised. Ironically, while China was celebrating 70 years of the Communist Party rule on October 1, 2019, Hong Kong experienced one of its most violent and chaotic days.
いよいよ最後の章です。The most recent protest。この章を読んで感じたのはやはり香港の痛み、胸が痛いです。1、平和的抗議活動の成果。2、国家安全法。3、香港国家安全維持法案。ご覧ください。
Activists have continued to assert that the general public in Hong Kong have little liberty in the polls, which has left them only with the action of protestation, the remaining recourse, to make their grievance known. Many young students, particularly those who were born after the 1997 transfer, have taken the risk of participating in street demonstration, peacefully as in the umbrella movement or otherwise, as their way of refracting the accelerating encroachment. And as noted earlier, some protests in the past were successful. The volatile state of affairs, with violence since 2019, led to an increasing desire among some of the Hong Kong lawmakers, particularly pro-Beijing ones, to try to legislate Article 23 of the Basic Law. Meanwhile, the Chinese government has further hardened its stance, particularly towards any movements that may appear as a direct challenge to its authority. On May 21, 2020, the Chinese government proposed a new national security bill, the second attempt after the initial failure in 2003, which was to be enacted in Hong Kong to prevent and punish secession, subversion, terrorism, separatism and foreign interference. The local response was immediate. The following day, a dozen pro-democrat lawmakers marched to the Chinese liaison office to show their disapproval. On June 30, 2020, nonetheless, the Chinese government approved a partially equivalent security law on Hong Kong that covers only the act of secession and subversion.
いかがでしたでしょうか。山ちゃん、生まれて初めて香港のことを理解したような気がします。奇跡奇跡以外の何者でもないですね。はい、それではこの後香港に何が起こるのかニュースから目が離せません。 Thank you for watching. I'll see you soon.